السيدات والسادة الحضور الكرام، أهلا وسهلا بكم. يسعدنا ويشرفنا حضوركم، ويسرنا في سلال التدريب وحفظ التراث استكمال سلسلتنا من المحاضرات ذات الصلة بعلم إدارة المصادر التراثية ومواضيع أخرى مرتبطة به ضمن مشروع علم الآثار الأردني كصناعة مستدامة. في سلسلتنا هذه سينضم إلينا مجموعة رائعة من أهم المتخصصين في الأردن ومن حول العالم العاملين في المجال من الآثاريين والمرممين والأنثروبولوجيين وعلماء المتاحف لتقديم مجموعة متنوعة من أكثر من 20 محاضرة مختلفة ستستمر على مدار العام. في هذه المناسبة اسمحوا لي أن أشكر جميع المحاضرين والمساهمين العاملين على إنجاح واستمرارية هذه السلسلة، ويسرنا اليوم أن نستضيف الدكتور إيان كويجت الذي سيقدم محاضرة بعنوان كم عدد الأشخاص الذين عاشوا في قرى العصر الحجري الحديث في الشرق الأدنى، تقييم نقدي للحجج الخاصة بالقرى الكبرى والعمران المبكر. الدكتور يعمل الآن كأستاذ لعلم الآثار والأنثروبولوجي ومدير الدراسات العليا في جامعة نوتردام، ويركز في أبحاثه على أصول الزراعة في الشرق الأدنى وعلم آثار المجاعة الأيرلندية وعصور ما قبل التاريخ في غرب أمريكا الشمالية، وهو متخصص في الجغرافيا الاجتماعية لحياة القرى ضمن المجتمعات الصغيرة في عصور ما قبل التاريخ والعصور التاريخية، وذلك بالاعتماد على الإنثوغرافيا والنظرية الاجتماعية وعلم الآثار. الدكتور هو مؤلف ومحرر مشارك ل7 كتب مختلفة، بالإضافة إلى أكثر من 100 مقالة علمية، وقد تم دعم أبحاثه من خلال زمالات ومنح كبرى من المؤسسة الوطنية للعلوم ومجلس أبحاث العلوم الاجتماعية والإنسانية في كندا ومعهد جامعة نوتردام وغيرها الكثير من المؤسسات العلمية المرموقة. سيتم بث المحاضرة مباشرة عبر زوم وعبر وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي ولاحقا عبر منصتنا على اليوتيوب في حالة رغبتكم في الرجوع إليها. في نهاية المحاضرة سيتاح للحاضرين شخصيا وافتراضيا عبر زوم السؤال والنقاش، حيث سيجيب الدكتور عن استفساراتكم. So please, Professor, you could start.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the organizers and the opportunity to be here with you. It's a wonderful collection of individuals who are going to be making presentations or have already made some presentations, and it's a pleasure to be part of this. So thank you very much to the organizers. To the audience, I hope today to be able to have a conversation, and as part of this, giving you a sense of some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of how many people lived in Neolithic villages. And coming back to that question in terms of, in some ways, re-engaging with what we think we have known and trying to think critically about some of that, especially that of thinking about early Neolithic villages, what we often call mega villages, and the arguments that somehow this is linked to early urbanism of some form. I want to think critically about that, looking at a number of different archaeology sites, but also looking at it from the standpoint of ethnography and looking at it from the standpoint of how villages are organized today when we start looking at the Near East in smaller scale villages, traditional villages, if you wish. And to think about what we can learn from that and thinking about that in terms of the archaeology and thinking about how those things fit together. So I want to look at a number of different case studies, not in any great detail, but using examples such as Ain Ghazal from Jordan, Basta, Beta, a number of different sites to try and think about that. And in some ways, to kind of rescale what has been argued at this point. So let me start with this. The first part to this that I want to lay out for you is that in some ways, we have to recognize that starting in the Neolithic, the pre-pottery Neolithic, we start to see the appearances of larger villages. And these initially in the middle pre-pottery Neolithic B, if you want to think about the earliest phases of Ain Ghazal, for example, what we see is that initially villages go from rectangular architecture that is well designed and freestanding, and then at a later point in the late pre-pottery Neolithic B, as you can see here in the background photo from this talk by Professor Hans-Georg Gebel, thinking about late pre-pottery Neolithic B sites, the large, extremely large ones, such as at Basta, Ain Ghazal, Asfaya. And the phrasing of these that we've adopted is one of that these are mega sites. That is, that they are so different from what we see earlier, and they are in very strong contrast to what we see later. And so we have this moment under which these large sites show up. And the question with that is, at least in the background, is not only one of economics, stone tool technology, mortuary practices, but also the fundamental question, which is how many people lived in these villages. And this is important because depending on what you argue, depending on the scale of the number of people that you believe who lived there, the natural argument, as you can see here with the quotation that's listed here, is that somehow this could be interpreted as almost urban. It is as if Neolithic societies are on the edge of becoming urban. Urban is a very complex term, one that is clearly used in our world today in very specific ways, thinking about the density of people, thinking about infrastructure, schools, sanitation, all kinds of different things. We have applied that term in a way largely based on the compaction of architecture. That is, in some ways, the core to the argument. It's not the number of burials. It's not the sort of social complexity, because in most cases, we see limited evidence for social differentiation here. It's really coming down to the architecture and the existence of buildings that are tightly spaced together, no longer freestanding, but packed together, that has changed people's minds and that sort of help people sort of think in terms of big urban complexes and what you would expect with that. Before we start talking much further, we have to recognize that when we think about early villages, we have to recognize that there's certain components to these villages, asking the question of what is the village? Some parts to this, of course, are that we have a degree of sedentism, that is, people living in the same place. We have the ability of people to store food, to be able to get food from the agricultural year and to store it so it can be used over seasons when there's not as much food available. Another component we recognize is that there needs to be what ecologists would call high resource diversity. That is both plants and animals, and then there's a diverse range of different plants and animals that can be hunted, that can be harvested, and that can be used. Another piece to this is that there needs to be the processing and harvesting technology. Whether you're talking about grinding tools, whether you're talking about sickles for harvesting, whether you're talking about projectile points for hunting gazelle or something else. So that there needs to be the opportunity to take advantage of the resources. The other part to it, which we now understand, is that there needs to be the potential, a good potential for domesticates. That is, certain plants and certain animals are better suited to be domesticated, to be manipulated in such a way where we can increase the food value from these, or we can increase the control of animals in some form. So that also needs to be one component of what we see of Neolithic villages as a package. The last one, which I've highlighted here in yellow for you, is that when we think about villages, high population density is also one of what we often accept as one of the hallmarks, one of the key components to these Neolithic villages. The challenge here is the question of what represents a high population density. And that's where things get complicated when we start thinking about this in different ways. So let me explain some parts to this. One aspect to this is that quite recently, over the last 15, 20 years, there's been much more research that has started to look at that of population and Neolithic demography. We can see this in terms of arguments at Neolithic sites, such as Catal Huyuk. We can see this in illustration here with the American Southwest, with this paper done by Tim Kohler. We can see it in this very important book edited by Jean-Pierre Bacapelle on the Neolithic demographic transition. And in each of one of these cases, what we're really seeing is a narrative that is suggesting that there's a progressive increase in population. And it is with these late pre-modern Neolithic villages that populations explode, and that's where we have that. The argument behind it is essentially what you see on the top up here, and that is that many buildings equal a high population level. And because of that the assumed high population, somehow this is near urban, despite the fact that it doesn't really feel, at least to me, like an urban context in any form. Not one that I would think about when you contrast it to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, whatever other period of time you want to think about in the context of the Levant. So let's think about this a little bit further, and let's think, as part of this, let's think about how that argument has come together. So there's been a number of researchers who have looked at sort of the question of how many people lived in the first villages, the Neolithic villages. And here, details matter. And that is that we build bigger arguments, major arguments, such as urbanism, on the basis of what individual researchers say about particular archaeological sites, including myself in this particular case. So that whether you're talking about beta, such as the article in the Levant, whether you're talking about Catal Huyuk, such as the other article, whether you're talking about other synthetic articles, such as the one that I published in this particular case. In each of these situations, it's a matter of we need to understand some of the detail to this. There's another part to it as well, though, and that is not only do we need to understand how we're making estimates for population, but we have to understand that arguments have a history. The argument for high population levels has a history in the field of archaeology. And this is where I want to go to first, because as far as I'm concerned, when we start looking at how people first estimated the number of individuals living in Neolithic sites, what we see is that those early estimates were based on surprisingly little data. They were not thinking in terms of excavated materials and then asking the question, for example, at Ain Ghazal, asking the question of, now we've excavated this area, how many people used to live here. Instead, in some cases, it's a matter that people made the arguments before they had actually excavated the sites. And this is really important. Let me show you one example of this so that we can sort of pull apart some of the complexities to see how that all works. And I'm not quite sure, but oh, there it goes. It was stuck for a second there. So I want to look at this example, and this is looking at Catal Huyuk. And the reason why I've decided to take a look at Catal Huyuk here is that it has a very long research history, one that with the exception of Jericho, it outdates anything else in terms of understanding the sort of the regional changes that take place, the temporal changes, I should say. So at Catal Huyuk, you have here a range of estimates for population. And this, by the way, is from a publication that myself and Eric Machiniak has just come out in Journal of Anthropological Archaeology. And what you can see, if you look closely at this, is that starting in 1965, James Mellert made the argument that at Catal Huyuk, there was 8,000 to 10,000 people living there. Another researcher by the name of Cohen argued at about 6,000 in 1970. Ian Kuijt came back with a range of 5,000 to 10,000. James Mellert then fine-tuned that to 5,000 to 7,000. Roger Matthews came out with an estimate as well based on some very good research to try and explore things. And then Ian Hodder and various other researchers have tried to look at this in terms of a range of people that used to live there. More recently, if you look, Joanna Plug and company have argued that perhaps 2,800 people have lived there. At a later point, back in November of 2021, Hodder argues that there are 8,000 people living at Catal Huyuk. So he is still, depending on conversations, the number of people is still presented as 3,500 to 8,000, an enormous number of people living there. Here's the part that's interesting, and that is that James Mellert was a student of V. Gordon Childe, who wrote the book on the Neolithic Revolution. He wrote a book on early urbanism. That was his sense of, while working at the Institute of Archaeology in London, of the expectation, the evolutionary expectation of going from Neolithic to Bronze Age, going into that trajectory, that you would see the emergence of urbanism in some capacity. James Mellert was deeply attracted to this. He was influenced by this. And his estimates that he started to use for the site, for Catal Huyuk, were not based in any systematic research to look at the number of buildings, how long buildings were occupied for, anything like that. It was not based on any of that, so much the aspiration of what V. Gordon Childe had suggested, but also that of sort of his intuition that with all of the architecture on the mound, that somehow this should be a situation where there are many thousands of people living there. And I would make the argument that to an extent, that has now been manifest in the current publications, that to an extent, that has continued to be perpetuated, with a few exceptions, such as the co-authored article that Joanna Plug has put forth. But largely, that narrative of many thousand people living at Catal has continued through V. Gordon Childe to James Mellert to Ian Hodder, etc. So here the point is, research initially is making, that researchers are making arguments that are intuitive, not based in any kind of scientific method for getting a population estimate. And that's one of the problems to this. And that is, if you look at Catal Huyuk here as an example, and that is that these numbers, when they were published in the 1960s, became crystallized. And I would argue that the illustration to the right is probably the biggest reason why these estimates of 8 to 10,000 have become crystallized. And that is the architectural reconstruction that he published in 1967 was that of compact row housing, building next to building next to building. Much the same way, if you look in the photograph up above, of something akin to row housing in a dense European urban environment. So that it is essentially this compaction of people in a modern world that then becomes incorporated and projected into the past. And that became the model under which so many of us have used over the years when we start thinking about Neolithic villages. Now, I have to say right off that I was one of those individuals. This, with this work that Eric McChiniak and I have recently published, this is my third attempt of publication to try and rethink some of these pieces and to think in terms of what works. And one of my initial pieces of work, now much to my horror, 24 years ago, was trying to estimate population based on site, this sort of the spread of archaeological material horizontally across an archaeology site. And on the basis of this in 2000, I was coming forth with estimates of 3,000 to 3,500 people for most of the major Neolithic sites in Jordan, Syria, Palestine, and spreading north. In 2008, and that first one that you see in 2000 is in red. In green, what you can see is that I went back to that. I was dissatisfied with that. And I looked at it from the standpoint of understanding population on the basis of structures, the number of structures, how many people would live in structures, and to try and approach estimates from that standpoint. And what I came out with, as you can see with these dashed lines, and this is from Birch Chapman's work in Levant, what you can see is at that point, I really felt that the numbers were clearly below 1,000, 600, 800 at most. And that's pretty well how I think about these villages at this point. I'm going to go and show you a little bit further with this third attempt that Machiniak and I have just published, that we've used a different method, and we've come back to figures, to estimates that are very similar to what I published in 2008. So I want to come back to that because the real problem here is that researchers now look at these as high-low figures and they accept the highest number. They don't look in terms of what the more recent research is saying, so much as coming back and saying, well, Kuijt in 2000 said there should be 3,500 people, and so that's the number. So unfortunately, those estimates now are uncritically accepted. And it is, I think, really leading to an inflation of the actual number of people who used to live in the sites that you would see in Jordan, in Syria, in other places. So let me expand on that and come back to it. Here's the first problem. And this is a problem that we all face as archaeologists. And that is, when we walk onto an archaeology site, we look at the distribution of material culture across the ground surface. And even though we know that this is essentially the garbage of human life, These are the broken tools. These are this is the food remains, all of those sort of parts of the garbage of human life. In some ways, when we think about population estimates, what we do is we assume that the end of where the human culture, the material culture of humans stops, that works almost as if it's a city limits. And that's from that point on, it's as if you're coming back to that illustration from Catal Huyuk, where you go from the outside of the village to the standing architecture, and from that point on, it's standing architecture. And that's a very poor assumption, one that I fell prey to years ago, one that now we really need to think about. So here's some of the critical assumptions that are involved in how we model and things we need to rethink about. First of all, we need to ask ourselves, how many buildings were occupied at the same time? If you look at this photograph in the background from Catal Huyuk, we have to ask ourselves, how many of those were actually occupied? The second question we have to ask ourselves is, how many years were these buildings used for? Were these used for 20? Were they used for 10? Were they used for 50? And then the next question we have to ask ourselves is, how many people actually lived in these buildings? And those are the critical assumptions that are tricky. That's where things get tricky as we try and sort of explore these different pieces. So let me come over here and look at this to illustrate some of the dimensions to this. And that is, here's a village, an ethnographic village from Kandahar, outside of Kandahar. And what you can see if you look at this closely is you can see rectangular buildings, mud architecture, a school in the center. You can see abandoned buildings through the middle. You can see alleyways and compound walls. You can see garden plots in different locations that are walled to protect them from animals. You can see trees and presumably the different places where people would go and have tea and relax. So the question is here, what is the start of the village? Even if you take this perimeter wall going around the outside of it, when you look inside of that area, you can see there's a whole range of open spaces. You can see that some buildings are not occupied anymore. They're essentially empty with no roof. So that what we see is a range of practices inside of this space. And we've lost track of that when we're doing population estimates. We've sort of glossed over that and are no longer attentive to that. Let's come back to some of those assumptions. First of all, it's now clear, based on research from many different places, that when you look at traditional mud brick architecture, which is what most Neolithic villages were, there may be differences in terms of whether you have a stone foundation and then mud brick walls above it. It may be more mud brick. There's variation there. But for the most part, the real question is, how long were these used for? And what we know from different research is that for the most part, these buildings, even when they're well maintained, are being used for 15 to 30 years. So these are not buildings that are made of stone or concrete that are going to last for 100 years. Even with maintenance, the mud on the walls deteriorates. Even with plastering, it deteriorates. You have problems in terms of the wood that's being used for construction there. You have insects. You have all kinds of reasons for why buildings are not lived in for more than really about one generation. And remember here, a generation of time in a Neolithic context is probably about 33 years. maybe 35. So that's what we know from biological anthropology. So let's look at this. And here, going back to something else that Eric Marciniak published, is that if we look at these buildings from Catal Huyuk, and if you look on the right-hand side, I've taken the number of years and translated it in terms of the number of generations. And really, if you look closely, you can see, and this is based on Bayesian analysis, very detailed scientific research, that really we're looking at single generation, in some cases less than 15 years, less than 30 years, 10 to 50. There are exceptions in here, but the big picture is that most buildings are only lived in for maybe a generation. Here's an example from Jericho, taking it a little bit closer to home. And that is, if you look at this famous section that I've redrawn here from Jericho Square E1, 2, and 5, with the radiocarbon dates, what we can see is that that section, which is quite deep, it's 4 meters in depth there, that section was occupied for 150 years. That's how long it took for all of those deposits to be put down in the ground. It works out to about 2.6 centimeters per year. That sounds like very little, but it's actually an awful lot when you start adding it up. Let's contrast this to a Catal Huyuk, so in central Turkey, and again with mud brick architecture, the same kind of thing. And what you can see here in this big, deep section is that you can see in the upper section, those lines coming across are all the floors for a series of buildings. And with these 8 buildings, they were constructed over 135 years. And that works out to about 3.3 centimeters per year. If you look at the lower section, below the buildings, that whole section was deposited again over 135 years. So that's about 2.3 centimeters per year. So what we're seeing is that these houses are being occupied for 20 to 25 years. The examples from Jericho, the examples from a Catal Huyuk, they're pretty well telling the same story. And that is really you're dealing with less than 1 generation for the occupation for each one of those buildings. Here's another aspect to this that we have to rethink. If you look in the upper corner, you can see these 2 illustrations, the 2 upper illustrations, that show you, in some ways, the view many people have of what a Neolithic village would have looked like. Again, compact buildings right next to each other that are all occupied, and that is essentially this very dense environment. The contrast that you can see here, a publication by Mike Charles at Catal Huyuk, is a different view. It's one that thinks in terms of the spatial packing of people, in that different areas are being used at different points of time, and that there are spaces between these different examples. This is really important because this is layering in much more of an ethnographic perspective. And I think it's really important to look at that because this is not a matter of continuous houses going across. That just doesn't make sense. So let me show you here and sort of one aspect to that. So there's 2 things I want to show you. First of all, I want to show you really what can we expect from one ethnographic village in terms of the packing of people. And second of all, asking the question of how many people lived in each Neolithic house. Commonly, we estimate, researchers have estimated, 4 to 5 people. But does that really fit? And the answer is No, I don't think it does. Let me show you. So here's some research from Patty Jo Watson. She did work in Iran, and as part of this, in 1960, she went and did a detailed mapping of a village. She mapped all of the structures, and then she went and she asked who lived in each building, what their names were, how old they were, what their family connections were. Now you can see this could just as easily be a place at Ain Ghazal or Asfaya or somewhere else. It's the same kind of layout. But here's where it gets interesting, because these are the different families. The pink, the blue, and the green are the different families. Also, the pink, blue, and green, those are the only buildings that are lived in. The other buildings are empty buildings that are being used for storing tools. They're being used for storing grain. So those buildings should not be counted in terms of population estimates. What you see now that I've put on screen is the building number, the number of adults and the number of children who live in these different buildings, and the age of the different people. The red ones and the black ones, the red ones relate to people who are married in. It's not as important. But what you can see here is that in some cases, there's 3 people, in some cases, 1 person that's living there, in some cases, a few more. The big part to this, however, is look at the number of children and the number of adults. So the big thing to get out of this is, first of all, not all buildings are lived in. Even if they're standing, they're used for different things. Second thing is, when we're talking about population estimate, in this illustration alone, you can see 50% of the people who live in these spaces are children. And on top of that, it's less than 5 people on average. So these are all things that we need to think about when we're doing population estimates. Here's what is undoubtedly the most scientific approach to population estimate. It's work by Craig Sesford, who years ago published a really, really good piece of research. It was one where, based on some earlier work by Ammerman, Sesford took a mathematical formula and, based on particular assumptions, he then generated a population estimate of between 3,500 to 8,000 people. His estimates, his assumptions, I should say, were, first of all, that 80% of the mound of Catal Huyuk was occupied. He then argued that he assumed that 10 to 20% were unoccupied, and he assumed that these structures were used between 45 and 90 years. This then produced with this explicit method, then produced the estimate of 3,500 to 8,000 people. I've written to him at different points and we've corresponded. It's interesting. He said, he related to me at one point that he never thought that this would sort of stay as long as a piece of research. And so it's nice to sort of re-engage with that. So let's take those estimates that Sesford used and let's think about them in terms of the archaeology and the ethnography, what we learned from the villages that I've just presented to you. So just as a recap, we can say that probably these villages are being used, these houses are being used for 15 to 25 years, rather than the 45 to 90 years argued by Sesford and others. Hodder has argued that some of these were used from 80 to 140 years ago. So what happens when we do this and we change the estimates for architectural density, how long buildings were used for? what we get is a very different picture. Statistically, what I want you to focus on here are the red squares. And if you're interested, this is in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology. It's just come out. And so you can look at this in more detail if you so desire. So here's Cessford's estimates. If you look at 45 years of building use, if you look at 90 years of building use, you see you get about 7,000 people. So that's how this number is being applied, or is being generated, I should say. If you look down below, that's visually pretty well what you'd think of. That is row housing, a giant hotel covering all of Catal Huyuk. This is the reconstruction you get if you look at numbers of buildings being used for 15 years or being used for 30 years. Instead, what you get is an estimate of about 330 to 1,100. Much more close to the kind of illustration you'd see with what Mike Charles and Amy Bogart and others have published there. To explore this further, what we did in our most recent publication is to look and develop 3 different models. And the different models are based on, if you look in the green up above, it shows you how long buildings were used for. And so this is a hypothetical model of 100 buildings. In the upper one, where it says scenario 1, excuse me, we are estimating 30 buildings of 20 years, 40 buildings that lasted for 30 years, 25 that lasted for 45 years, etc. And that gives, in the pink square right below it, an average of 27.7 years of building use life. So we're modeling some buildings being used for a long time and maintained for a long time, other ones just for 15, 20 years. You can see in scenario 3, that's a very different estimate. That's one that's working under generating a model for many buildings being occupied for a long period of time. So this is a way of trying to understand average use life, but doing it from a combination of hypothetical buildings, 100 of them at a time. This is the interesting part, and that is when you start to compare them and when you start looking at this, statistically, this is what emerges. If you assume that 20% of the building, of the mound, is covered, that blue line is what you get. If you assume that 80% of the mound is covered, which is essentially what Cessford and Hodder and others have done, then you get this kind of curve that goes up. And then below that, you can see average building use life. So if you assume, as Hodder and Cessford did, that buildings are used for, let's say, 45 years or 90 years, you're going to end up with, and that 80% of the mound is covered, you're going to end up with a population estimate of 7,000 plus people. Conversely, if you're going to side with the kind of ethnographic information that I've been trying to present to you, then what you get is an estimate that's much, much lower. And what we've argued in our publication is that probably there would have been something around 600 to 800 people living in Catal Huyuk at the Classic period. I would argue that that's probably a good estimate as well for a place like Ain Ghazal or a place like Basta. It's not a popular argument because many of my colleagues envision it as that there were many thousand people living there. But from this ethnographic standpoint, this suggests that the kind of numbers that we've been talking about are not thousands and thousands. Instead, it's probably more akin to these red dots that you see here for places like Basta, Ain Ghazal, Esfaya, Wadi Shaib, etc. So the critical point is that surface distribution does not equal the entire village. There would have been open spaces, and there also would have been buildings that are not used as long as people have estimated. And so what we're really arguing is that in some ways, the estimates for the number of people living in these villages is probably much higher than actually existed. Let me turn to that for a second and talk about how big a difference that is, but also what that means. So here's a Google Map photograph, a screen capture, looking at the Jordan Valley. And as you look down below here, you can see in the big red square, those are the population estimates that are largely accepted. And unfortunately, based at least partially on some of the research I did 20 plus years ago. What I've argued in 2008, and now using different methods coming back to it, arguing that in fact, the green estimates are much more accurate. And those are probably a better indication of the number of people that were living in places like Ain Jamam, Basta, etc. The other part to it that is not included in here is that we have to understand that, let's say 40% of these people would have been children below the age of 5. Maybe it's the age of 10. Maybe it's not 40%. Maybe it's only 35. But the point is that as villages, we should no longer be talking about 7,000 people, 8,000 people. Instead, we should be thinking about something that's much smaller in scale. There's another question here, and one that I don't think we've really figured out. And that is, how do we explain all these people living in the same place? To what extent is this a matter of population growth within the entire region versus that of aggregation into particular settlements? So, for example, if you look at this illustration of Catal Huyuk, what you can see here, going from the early PP&B through to the late Pottery Neolithic, is that you see very different settlement patterns. And in the late PP&B, you can see the emergence of a big mega site. And by the way, I have no problems using that as a term. My objection is not one of recognizing a mega site in terms of the architectural density and everything else. It's the population estimates to it that I don't agree with. So something is going on in the way of people coming together, whether you're talking about Esfaya, whether you're talking about Basta. There's something we don't entirely understand, because I think it's not just regional growth. I think people are moving from other locations into these bigger sites. And that's something that we need to better understand in some form. Let me sort of think about some of the bigger pieces here. And that is, why does this all matter? Why does population matter? Well, there's a couple different dimensions to this. The first one is, if we think of Neolithic villages, we need to think in terms of how much food does it take to feed a village? That requires food storage of some form. We also ask the question of social networks for agriculture, for example. And that is, depending on how much food you need and how many people live in the village, that changes these relationships enormously. So the number of people is actually really important to understand social organization. The other part to it is some people have talked in terms of early urbanism. I don't think that's the case. I think when we start looking in a nuanced way at some of our arguments, what we see is that these villages they're not near urban or early urbanism in some form. These are still relatively small villages. If we're talking about less than 1,000, it's still relatively small villages in scale. Again, I totally agree that these are something that's totally different from what we're seeing in the middle pre-pottery Neolithic B to the late pre-pottery Neolithic B and to the pottery Neolithic. So we're all in agreement about that. The question is, how many people live there, and does that really necessitate the label of urbanism? And I'm not comfortable with using that term at this point. So just to sort of sum up, thinking about these bigger pieces, this is a chart that I did a number of years ago, tried to look at changes in population and trying to think in terms of sort of growth as well as abandonment, and sort of thinking about how do we have population aggregation? How do we have dispersal that's taking place? And what does this mean in terms of population levels? I don't know what's triggering these things off. The 8.2K event with climatic change is something that is potentially very important for us to think about. The kind of stability, whether it's economic or climatic, is really important. The potential, as some very good scholars have pointed out, such as Gary Rolfson, of conflict and maybe people coming to live together for some of those reasons. I don't know, but this is now, having now gone back and thought about sort of population at these three different points of writing in my history, I'm very much to the view that we've overinflated the number of people who probably lived there in the past. And I think we need to re-engage with the whole question of what is the pre-Potter Neolithic village? What is coming about that brings these people together? Why are people building so much architecture? And then, to an extent, why do we have the collapse of these villages, the dispersal of people, the abandonment of these villages in some form? I don't know the answer to that. Hopefully, some of the talks that are going to be presented as part of this series going on may shed some light on that. But unquestionably, they'll provide you with some other information along the question of sort of the evolution and change within the Neolithic context, which is one of the fascinating stories when we think in terms of human development in so many different ways. Thank you very much. I've very much enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with you all, and best to all of you as you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So let's see if we have any question here. Anyone have any question?
Good evening. I actually have a question about, you have talked at the beginning about material culture, and also at one point you have talked about food. So I was curious to know if there is any study linking the amount of food, for example, to the number of houses that could determine, better help determining the number of people, I guess relatively to a specific site. But is anyone attempted something like this?
I think that's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is really no. People have done research in terms of how many calories people need, in a contemporary world today, how many calories people need each day, the different types of calories, whether it's, a combination of bulgur wheat and hummus and protein from meat, sort of those kinds of questions. But archaeologists on the whole really have not dived into that question. And I think part of it is that, at least when we think in terms of plant and animal research, so zoo archaeology and paleobotany, some of the biggest questions have been just that of identifying the species and identifying the extent to which these are domesticated versus wild in some form. So I don't think we've got to that point of undertaking modeling that allows us to think about those things. I think it's absolutely critical. I think your question is totally on the money, and I would love to have people deal with that kind of a question. So great question.
اوكي، اي حد عنده اسئله؟ Is there any question here? I guess we do not have a question for now. So thank you so much, Professor. It was a very interesting topic. And thank you for highlighting this kind of topics. And I guess now we will end this lecture. Thank you so much again.
Of course. Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this very important talk series.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you again.